A couple of years ago, I decided to write a book that was intended as a political history of the 2000s. It got the title, although only in Swedish, The Return of Big Government. I tried to sell it to audiences as a book for you who really want to work on your autumn depression. Be relieved. It's not. It's not. It's a talk, not a work session. So you don't have to work too much about it. But I realized that the history of the 2000s was a history about war, crisis, and galloping indebtedness. And this was published in 2017, mind you, before the pandemic and Russia's full scale in Ukraine. The reason I wrote that book and the reason I'm bringing up in a talk at a conference that is supposed to be about the future is my impression that much of the debate on current issues is still missing what has happened in the 2000s. We're still here in the cozy end of the 20th century, the opening of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism, the end of the Cold War, globalization. I was there. I was even young at the time, so I can confirm it was in many ways a very good times indeed. So I can understand this, but my point is something else. That we are still here has led to a widening split between two political camps. We have the all is well camp that says that they're still optimistic about the future and the fact that trade, democracy, and globalization will bring it about, that better future. And we have the worried and discontent camp. They challenge the former with the accusation, look at the catastrophic results that your naive belief in peace, freedom, and markets have brought about in this world. And my point is that these two camps have both missed to take account what has happened in the 2000s, which in many ways are a radical shift from these trends, yet rarely mentioned and taken into account. The war on terror, for example, the response to the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001, with the American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. That changed the mood all over the world, but mostly in America. There was a shift that could be noticed even in films. Hadley Freeman has written a wonderful book about the films of the 1980s, Life Moves Pretty Fast. And in most of these books, you can actually see the government as the villain. Think, for example, of E.T., if you have seen that. An illegal alien coming here, and the bad guys are the government in suits, anonymous and trying to take him away. Or think of Ghostbusters, probably the last movie ever, a comical film about people not fitting into either government or the academy, but starting their own company to fight ghosts. And the villain in this is actually an environmental agency bureaucrat. I haven't seen much of that lately. Even when the government decided to make a recruitment film, Top Gun, they had to add a maverick, an individual going for himself to be able to sell the message. Go to the 2000s, early 2000s, and you have instead TV series like 24, banging in the message, Kiefer Sutherland chasing bad guys with every means necessary, banging in the message that brutality is necessary and practical to bring about results. And that was much of what the war in terror was about. And we can in hindsight see that it didn't make the world safer, neither there nor here. Just to take one example of unintended consequences from a big state intervention. Without the US decision to invade not only Afghanistan, where the Al-Qaeda terrorists were actually hiding, but Iraq, who for all its fault had nothing to do with the terrorist plot, the Islamic State would never have existed. With the Iraq invasion, which also, by the way, was a gift to pressured Al-Qaeda, an unexpected coalition could be formed in the prison camp Bucca in Iraq between former officers of Saddam Hussein's army and militant jihadists. And that was what made it into such extremely dangerous organization, the Islamic State or ISIS. The biggest terrorist threat to the West in the 2010s would never have formed if not for the Iraq invasion. The war on terror led to an expansion of the state and its power also at home. More surveillance, and while we're at it, why not go after people sharing music or unpopular opinions as well? Stricter border controls, why not make poor people also turned into security threats? Although most terrorists from abroad have actually arrived legally. There was a mood shift in the United States. After the September 11th attack in 2001, trust in government institutions of every kind skyrocketed. Almost every authority, apart from the flight authority, for apparent reasons, terrorists flew to plane after all other government agencies got enormous more trust in those institutions. And this trust was used by George W. Bush to increase government spending and meddling of every kind, especially to win the election in 2004. The US did not only get expensive military adventures and behemoths like the Homeland Security and increasing mass surveillance. The foreign policy budget increased as well, where the US earlier had been pushing for international cuts in subsidies. They also decided on a huge increase in promises and hence future costs in Medicare and Medicaid, that is welfare spending for the elderly. And the earlier ambitions to liberalize trade were thwarted by tariffs on steel. It was comeback years for big government, with increasing spending and regulation in almost every area. Of all the expansions of government in the West during this period, the worst and most extreme was the torture. A bit of personal background here. In the beginning of the 1990s, there were manifestations in many Swedish countries called Monday meetings at noon every Monday, supporting freedom for the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They were occupied by the Soviet Union by the time and communists. I used to skip school to go to these meetings in my hometown, Karlskrona, in South Sweden. And on the 66th meeting in the early summer of 1991, I got to speak. As an aside, I can mention that the Monday meetings are back on the same places in Sweden these days. And I have spoken to date at 3 times in Stockholm now, and the issue is, of course, supporting the liberty for Ukraine from the Russian war and oppression. They are gathering again this moment. Anyway, my first talk as a young teenager was my tiny, tiny part in beating communism and collapsing the Soviet Union. What did you do when you were skipping school, Greta Thunberg? We won. The Baltic states liberated themselves from both communism and the Russian occupation. In Vilnius, Lithuania, the KGB headquarters, where hundreds of people were executed and many more interrogated, tortured, and imprisoned in small cells in the basement, it was turned into a museum. Communism and its oppressive system was made history. But history didn't end. In 2003, a new secret prison opened outside Vilnius. Now it was the USA that tortured suspected people that had been kidnapped and were held without trial or due process. It was one of the CIA black sites around the world, a grotesque mismanagement of power. Now, in afterhand, we know that only a few of the imprisoned and tortured suspects were guilty. Of the 507 prisoners ending up at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, 55% were innocent and only 8% part of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization behind the September 11th attack. Perhaps no wonder when CIA offered great monetary rewards to Afghan warlords for every suspected terrorist they delivered. That's economic incentives for you. Let's stop to note that the state brutality was not efficient. In fact, the torture did not lead to useful information. That came from traditional interrogation methods used by the FBI that was actually derailed when CIA stepped in. So the fictional dilemmas from 24 was just that, fiction. In reality, it was a shame. That torture program was a shame, assisted by 21 European countries, including Sweden. My country assisted the kidnapping of 2 Egyptians that we had promised protection from the Egypt military rule, but they were brought back there by the CIA and they're tortured and imprisoned. Only in Italy has there been any judicial consequences for the aggressors. It stands as a first but not last example of an extreme and unexpected expansion of government power in the first years of the new millennium. And on the subject of expansion, let's also note that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were the most expensive wars in American history. An estimate at Brown University puts the cost to date at $8 trillion. That number has 12 zeros. So to illustrate, think that you add $1 a second. Quite a demanding task. If you add $1 a second, it takes 11 days to get to 1 million. It takes you to take you to 1 billion, it takes 32 years. And hence, to get to 1 trillion, it takes 32,000 years. That's how big that number is. $8 trillion is the cost of the wars to date. One thing that makes this war stand out is that almost all costs of the war has been financed by debt. The American public has thus not been aware of the true costs. This has itself added costs. When it has been paid down around 2050, just the interest cost of the war on terror is estimated at around $6.5 trillion. As well as the human cost in lost lives, injuries, and migration crisis, and the still lingering insecurity and instability, this economic cost and the decision to send the bill to coming generations is sure to cast a long shadow over the future. So to sum up, the war on terror resulted in expansion of state power, unintended consequences that showed that brutality didn't work. The IS was created, and this at the cost of $8 trillion, most of it alone from future generations. Did $8 trillion sound much? The estimated cost of the financial crisis in 2008 often ranged up to $20 trillion, often with the reservation that it could still be much higher. An estimate from Dallas Fed some 10 years ago put the cost in the range of $6 to $14 trillion, with the caveat that it could be double that. The crisis was a result of politicians promising artificially cheap loans for housing. That was one of many promises by George W. Bush in the campaign to get re-elected in 2004, probably the most costful election to date. To target ethnic minorities in that election, it was declared racist that lending institutions demanded down payments for loans to buy a house. That's the money you pay yourself on top of the loan. So using if that wasn't bad enough, using public-private lending companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these cheap loans were then spread to the whole market, resulting not in thousands of failed loans, but millions of loans where the lender could have trouble meeting the payments. These loans had by then been repackaged in financial instruments with fancy names like mortgage-backed securities, and a AAA credit rating from an oligopoly rating market made it a valuable asset. So in 2008, or really starting in 2007, the bubble burst. It's always easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, making judgment in hindsight. In Swedish, we call it being after wise. And of course, that is simple, but still, it is better than be after stupid and not learning, at least, from the consequences from the mistakes you made. Studies that have afterward shown that without the political decision to make loans artificially cheap, nothing close to what actually happened would be possible. Financial markets do get carried away by technological innovation, for example, as in the information technology boom around the millennium shift. But this crisis was greatly worsened by a government expanding in scope and ambitions. And this was the case in Europe as well. The German economist Hans Werner Sinn explained how the Eurozone created its own crisis by continuing cheap emergency loans after the immediate crisis was over in 2009. We are usually told the opposite, that this was a crisis of deregulated markets, totally ignoring the government footprints all over the crime scene. And then we are told that the government afterwards stepped in to save everything. And that latter part is not true either. The recovery after the financial crisis have been remarkably slower than after former crises. Growth and productivity are slower in pace in both Europe and the US. More and more evidence point to government intervention as the culprit even here. This subject has been covered by financial economist Ruchir Sharma, especially in his latest book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, that I really recommend. But in short, a government flooding the market with cheap credits and loans through central banks, and also with spending and guarantees on generous bailouts, keeps a lot of companies going that are not really profitable. Those companies, can you guess what they are called? They're called pineapples. Oh, sorry. They're called zombies. And they were unusual in Western economies in the 1980s and the 1990s, although spotted somewhat earlier in Japan. But during the 2000s, and especially in latter years, they spread through European and American economy, and it can now be around 20% of the capital invested that are invested in zombie companies. And almost 1 in 10 employed could be working in one. And this is one reason for a stagnating economy. Companies that get by in this way do not get more productive and hence are not able to offer employees growing salaries. We talk about government rescuing the economy. But what do they really do when they rescue the economy? They save companies whose products people are not prepared to pay for. So the taxpayers, in one way or another, have to pay for products they have chosen not to buy. And then they have less money, of course, to buy the products they do want. And capital are bound in companies making products they don't want. So new and better companies have a harder time to establish themselves, grow, and compete. But the zombies are usually small companies. So doesn't the tech giants of our day more than make up for this being they're being extremely profitable? Unfortunately, not. They are actually less productive than large companies were 2 decades ago. Since then, the share of productivity growth that comes from the largest companies are down by 1/3. So what have made them so dominant and profitable, if not their ability to serve customers? the same culprits are at work here. Growing regulation are sometimes seen as progressive, but in practice their effects work in the opposite direction. They benefit the already big and dominant companies because they are better seated than a newcomer to comply with regulations. And the more complicated the rules get, the more dominant the already big companies get. That effect has been studied in sector after sector in recent years. Cheap credit also benefits the big companies since they have easier access to them than smaller competitors. This initially makes them more productive, and we saw that in the beginning of the 2000s. They invest more, but over time they get dominant and realize they don't have to make all that effort. And that is when they start being the real cash cow for the owners. As you all know, the profit margin is higher in non-competitive markets. And the result is a situation sometimes referred to as socialism for the rich. When you make money on the financial market, they're yours to keep. But when you start losing money, the government steps in and saves you. People complaining about the shortcomings of the social safety net in recent years, they have obviously not been billionaires. This is also what explained the growing inequality in the economies of lately. As a financial investor, Stanley Druckenmiller explained in 2013 after the Federal Reserve made a decision to prolong easy credit. This is fantastic for every rich person. This is the biggest redistribution of wealth from the middle class and the poor to the rich ever. Who owns assets? The rich, the billionaires. You think Warren Buffett hates this stuff? You think I hate this stuff? I had a very good day yesterday. It works like this. If you own a house or an apartment, cheap credits have inflated its value. We didn't have consumer price inflation from all the stimulus money during this time, at least not until recently. But boy, did we have asset price inflation and housing price inflation. The effect on inequality is the following. If you have owned your own house and some stock for years, you're happy. If you own 1,000 houses or a lot of assets, you're 1,000 times happier. And if you, like almost half of the population earning the least in Sweden, had most of what you save on a bank account, you, on the other hand, had zero interest on those savings. And another situation you do not want to be in with this kind of game is being the young student coming home explaining, "Mom, Dad, I finished my exam, I got my dream job, now I only have to find a place to stay." You'll find that in most countries, that situation has gotten more and more expensive. It is in many ways you, the younger generation, that are cheated by this policy of cheap credits. Remember that the natural thing on a functioning competitive market is for stuff to get cheaper and cheaper. But the housing market in most countries are regulated so as to benefit those who already have a roof over their head. Be it by controlled lower rents leading to queues and a more expensive second-hand rating, or by an ability to protest any new exploitation and building in your own neighborhood, and add to this cheap loans to the most creditworthy. I moved to Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, in the 1990s from a small town in the south. My parents don't have any money. They did when I was a small kid, but that's another story. Me and my wife bought our first flat in 1997 and last moved in 2009. And this is what have given me opportunities to work with all the stuff I ever wanted. Publishing Ayn Rand books, writing my own books, and now write for a newspaper. But due to the development of a housing market that had benefited me immensely, a 10, 20, or 30 years younger me could never have done the same thing, or only with much greater difficulty. Talented young people without rich parents moving to the cities where there are most opportunities face barriers that get higher and higher. This is also a reason behind slowing productivity. So this is the lesson of the financial crisis. Effects that, just as with the war on terror are still very much around us today, and not in a positive way. Yet the debts amassed from these two adventures, the war on terror and the financial crisis, are peanuts compared to the real pyramid scheme, the welfare state. I'm sorry, it's called a Ponzi scheme. I realized too late when I was late with my class. But the thing is, some pay in and won't get money out. Only the first in are the ones to really win. For a long time, it was easy for politicians to promise more and more healthcare, education, daycare, pensions, and social insurance. For one thing, many of the schemes are quite cheap in the beginning, hence easy to roll out, such as state pension schemes financed by those working. The true costs of the system are revealed decades later. But countries in the West also had it easy in many post-war decades of the 20th century, and especially the last 2 decades of the 20th century, due to 3 other trends. A growing workforce as a share of the total population is the first, both as an effect of the big boomer generation entering and staying in the workforce, and because more women stepped into the labor force. And the second one was new countries entering the global market after liberalizing their economies. Notably China, India, and the former communist-ruled countries in the Central and Eastern Europe. This made all kinds of imported goods cheaper, notably consumer goods, especially consumer electrics. And now I need to delve in for a moment on another cheesy 1980s film. Has anyone seen National Lampoon's European Vacation with Chevy Chase? No takers. Oh, you didn't miss much, but you did miss. They compete in the beginning in a game show called Pig in a Poke. As you can imagine, it was quite humiliating. Why did they humiliate themselves like that? Well, apart from the first prize, a travel to Europe, the prizes in 1985 were quite ordinary kitchen equipment, like a microwave oven or a blender. Those were luxury goods then, in 1985. They could take something that a monthly worker's salary to pay for, and were often produced at the same location, every single part. And then came globalization, with specialization of the making of every component, which opened for wealth creation and decreased poverty in many countries, but also made kitchen appliances that in the 80s were luxury goods into everyday consumer products. Today you would just say, where should I put it? It requires just a few hours of work to buy, making salaries last longer. Of course, back then they couldn't even imagine throwing in a mobile phone as a price. They were big as bricks, could only be used to make very expensive phone calls, and for this extremely rich people paid thousands of dollars. Neither Robin Hood nor any socialist politician could accomplish the redistribution that capitalism makes possible over time by making things like mobile phones or kitchen appliances available and affordable for ordinary people, especially when more countries joined the market. And that's what happened in the last 2 decades of the 1900s. So the one-time effect of adding more countries to the network of specialized production in an increasingly global economy could not be overstated. It gradually made salaries last longer, which is not as obvious as getting a pay rise, but it makes the same difference. And then it is the third. The third trend was a peace dividend, resulting from the end of the Cold War. After the fall of communism and the Soviet Union in the years around 1989, the world became much more peaceful. As a result, governments did not have to spend as much on the military and the defense. So during the last decades of the 20th century, many Western countries had a large and growing share of its population in the workforce, hence paying in more taxes and costing less in benefits. Purchases became cheaper, including public procurement, thus increasing people's real wages due to large part of the world entering the global market. And the governments could spend less on the defense due to the end of the Cold War. In other words, it was easy for politicians to promise more and spend more. But what's the status of these trends these days? As some of you might have already concluded, not so good. They're not totally opposite, at least not everywhere. Female labor participation continued to increase in many countries up to this day. But the demographic trend in many countries for now and the decades ahead will see an increasing share of population among the elderly, a trend that grows stronger as people live longer. This is good news, of course, but it means increasing costs in pensions, healthcare, and services. And these have to be financed by a shrinking labor force as a smaller proportion of the population are of working age. We do not have the influx of new countries joining the global market, at least not very many, although we hope for African countries bursting with young people to take that step. We have rather the opposite trend toward deglobalization by trade barriers and increasing authoritarianism in countries like China, making it more difficult to invest and do business in and with the country. And of course, Russia has to be sealed off economically to contain their aggressive ambitions. This increases costs of living and also means more people need and are qualified for government benefits. Which turns us to the third trend. The peace dividend is no more. Due to, first and foremost, Russian aggression, countries in Europe again have to tie up more resources in the defense sector. But actually, this trend toward increasing levels of armed conflicts came earlier. After having increased for 4 decades, going back to the 1950s, armed conflicts decreased by almost 40% due to one measures from 1992, after the end of the Cold War, and up until 2005, as war became fewer and less lethal. But then, after 2005, they started to increase again, and we now, after 2022, have a full-scale war in Europe. By the way, this trend is almost exactly overlap the trend of basic freedoms as measured by the think tank Freedom House. Free and fair elections, free press, free civil society, and the like. Those freedoms increased overall and globally for every year between 1988 and 2005. Every year. And then they started to decrease for every year since then, from 2005 up until now. I mean, covariation does not automatically mean causation, but this pattern is a strong argument for the connection between liberty and peace, and sadly, increasingly during the 2000s, between unfreedom and war. To point out what should be the obvious conclusion, all these recent trends makes the financing of the same welfare benefits as before much harder and more expensive. How much harder? David Walker, the former government controller in the US, have calculated how much additional resources it would take to pay for the already promised welfare. That is the same welfare that is promised today, not more. And he estimated the cost in the election year 2012. He warned it was running up to $62 trillion. He wasn't listened to. In 2016, he had to warn again that the cost, just to fulfill the promises, mind you, again, it was in the range of $65 to $103 trillion. He was not listened to, and now around 125 trillion is to be found to fund today's welfare promises in the US. And this is not only the US. The average national debt ratio in the Eurozone is now around 100% of GDP. In Italy, it runs around 160%, and Greece 200%. That is despite a rule that the national debt of any joining country could not exceed 60%. France has not had a balanced budget since 1975. This is how welfare states increasingly are funded since around the 1980s, alas, even in the good times. The ruling politicians, of course, are well aware of this problem. So they keep promising even more benefits, especially for the elderly, as you know. It's perfectly logical. How could they otherwise get elected? Remember, there are larger cohorts of elder people, and they are also more prone to vote than younger generation. Hence, they give power to those that promise benefits. Even in the fiscally prudent Germany, the ruling parties a couple of years ago raised the pensions and lowered the retirement age. This in a country where the amassed debt in the retirement system already before is around 3 years of GDP. A cynical German economist quipped apropos this that the younger generations do what they can to avoid the debts. They avoid being born, a reference to the shrinking birth rate. I'm sorry, these trillion-dollar questions are not so fun to talk about. So we don't, though perhaps we should. The takeaway message from this is that the one way or another promised welfare by politicians will fail to materialize and yet come at an increasing cost. Then, of course, came the pandemic in 2020, and with it the global spread of a dangerous virus. Yes, of course, the COVID virus was bad enough, but I'm talking here about another virus that spread among us intellectuals, in the media and in the corridors of power. I'm calling it, oh, sorry, here was the welfare debt, to remind you. But what happened during the pandemic? What kind of virus? I'm sorry, I'm not a picture guy, I realize, but this. How we learned to stop worrying about shrinking freedom and growing debt and started to love the state. The awe for the all-powerful state reached some form of a crescendo during the first week after the pandemic rolled in over Europe. The Brits, for example, thought it was World War II all over again. The Financial Times, usually a balanced source of news, wrote in March 2020, "In recent days, UK government ministers have invoked the spirit of wartime mobilization, calling for a wholehearted national effort to stem the advance of coronavirus. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, had talked about running a wartime government, taking steps that are unprecedented since World War II. With the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, called for one gigantic national effort on par with the time when our cities were pounded during the Blitz. Similar rhetoric is being employed by ministers in other countries," write Financial Times. Among intellectuals, the mood was celebratory. Linking to this Financial Times article, economist Branko Milanovic wrote, "Everything that seemed impossible, anti-constitutional, taboo, immovable custom only 2 weeks ago has been tossed overboard." Swedish philosopher Jonna Bornemark later joined in with the following telling description: "Rarely have we seen such powerful action as when whole societies were shut down." Although writing this in a book, she does not pause for even one sentence to reflect on what should be a glaring contradiction. Action was in many ways the very thing that government had outlawed. The societies that were shut down had, of course, in almost every way their scope of actions diminished. People were in some cases not even allowed to leave their homes. Many could not work. How could this be described as increased power to act? Only by focusing exclusively on the government, on state action and the power of politicians, could this moment be described as a manifestation of power and action. For society, its citizens and companies, it was more often than not a period of less possibilities and less power to act. My point here is not that no government action was necessary to counter the virus. There is, as Ayn Rand pointed out, an ethics limited to emergencies, and that goes for governments as well. Restrictions that do not and should not usually apply can be proper during, for example, wars or emergencies such as containing a lethal virus. My point is rather that, yet again, during the 2000s, the rollout of state power went too far. The unreserved optimism with which it was greeted was definitely uncalled for. It was not state lockdown or other far-reaching restrictions that saved us. It was actually, in more ways than have been recognized, the globalization of production that allowed parts of the world not disease-ridden at the moment to produce and sell medical and test equipment of all kinds. Europe imported most of this from Asia during the critical months. And add to this the dog that didn't bark, the availability of food, home electronics, and everything else that made life more bearable and made working from distance an option for many sectors. This was in many ways what alleviated the crisis, not government restrictions. And then it was, of course, human ingenuity that in unexpected companies and ways found vaccines in record time, which could yet again be distributed globally, which made access to the best vaccine a possibility for more people than if everyone had produced them for themselves. Sweden, as you might know, managed with somewhat less restrictions and did not fully buy into this powerful action talk. But then it wasn't really that necessary. I mean, it's not hard to get Swedes to self-isolate. We're not that social to begin with, and we live in a country full of vast space. And the irony is that after managing with less restrictions and also with the evidence of the rifts and mistrust they created were imposed, Sweden is actually on the way to impose new emergency legislation that in all kinds of situations gives centralized and unbalanced emergency power to the ruling politicians. So Sweden are, unfortunately, yet another example of the increasing faith in state power, only a late adapter. And this trend is the one I've been describing for every major crisis during the 2000s, the return of big government. Policy-wise, during the pandemic, we got more of almost every trend that got worse during the earlier years in the 2000s. More deficit spending, a more far-reaching government, more cheap credits and monetary stimulus. The financial markets actually boomed, high on inflated central bank credit, while the real economy was floundering. Again, we should note that the government measures took a particular toll on the young. It was harder to study, and young adults, of course, live in smaller space, and more of the social life occur in the public areas that was shut down, not least university students like yourself. Many among you at the time lost some formative years of social experience. Yet the lesson many seem to take from this is that this could and should continue. Leaving the pandemic, many politicians seem to be high on the experience of being able to spend and regulate seemingly without restrictions, and declared they were finally ready to let go of the inhibitions from the so-called neoliberal age, as if they hadn't tried that over and over again lately. So here we are, in the present, at a conference dedicated to the future. I'll get to that. But first, I'll ask you to ponder on this quite recent history. The war on terror, the financial crisis and its aftermath, the growing welfare state and its increasing promises, though not always delivery, and the pandemic. My impression, as I said in the beginning, is that not only is this recent history mischaracterized, but it's also to a large extent absent, especially as an explanation for what has been going wrong in recent years. Be it slowing growth, rising authoritarianism, or decreasing expectations for the future in the general public, the blame always tends to go back to the liberalism of the 1980s and 1990s, and policy measures such as deregulation, globalization, and a supposedly shrinking state that someone have seen somewhere, I don't know where. Think for a moment of the implications of including recent history as at least a possible culprit for some of our problems. I'll gladly listen to some of your thoughts, but first I'll share one of mine. This takes us to the future. To be more precise, 1998. Please bear with me. In 2018, a magazine that I wrote for celebrated 20 years. I was asked what was the biggest difference between then and now. My answer was that back then, everybody longed for the future. Nowadays, people long for the past. Something lost that needs to be restored or great again as it was before it was allegedly stolen. I played with that in my own title. Why is that? Back in 1998 was written a quite prescient book, though probably not in the way its author had intended. It was written by libertarian journalist and thinker Virginia Postrel, and it was called The Future and Its Enemies. A book like that in the late 1990s, of course, were on the side of the future, what Virginia Postrel called dynamism. She wrote about a broad camp of liberty-minded, tech-optimist environmentalists who may disagree on the details and the exact politics, but who saw individual learning and playfulness and social trial and error in and outside markets as fundamental to creating a better future. And it would be a fun one too. One example is of beach volleyball and how an American politician of a dynamist mindset had declared that this sport that in 40 years had developed into an Olympic sport and big business was what freedom was all about, and that no one could have brought it about by planning. At the time, after around 2 decades of at least piecemeal liberalization and democratization, and with the hype around the internet and information technology, which was by then a highly decentralized and spontaneously driven process, this dynamistic outlook looked like almost self-evident. As with the balanced American budget around the same time, American budgets around the same time were balanced for the last time. It seems like almost science fiction today, but around the millennium shift, United States had a balanced budget. They are not even close nowadays. And this worldview might seem also like much of science fiction. So what happened? As I said, the title of the book was The Future and Its Enemies. So who were the enemies? The enemies of dynamism necessary for a brighter future are the stasists. They want order and control and hence tend to be against the prerequisites for a dynamic development. This was a broad camp, as with the dynamists. Postrel describes stasists of 2 different kinds, the technocrats and the reactionaries. The reactionaries are the outright enemies of the future, often warning that society is doomed and depraved, needing a drastic turn under their political control, of course, to be saved and restored to a glorious and stable past. These were fringes in the 1990s, but fits most right-wing and some left-wing populists today. The technocrats are a quite different breed. They are not outright enemies of the future, nor of innovation and development, far from it, but their demands to or belief that they have to control every process makes them friends of stasis in practice. They tend to stifle innovation and development, sometimes with the explicit aim of bringing it about. An obvious example of the European Union bureaucracy. Europe might not have as many tech companies as the US, but we have a lot more regulation of tech companies. The EU even has ambitious regulation of artificial intelligence, but the actual AI development mostly occur in other parts of the world, mainly the US. The will to have control over the process and avoid every thinkable negative consequence tend to stifle much of the development in the first place. Europe famously decided on the first growth strategy, the Lisbon strategy, in the 2000s. Following 10 years later by the 2020 strategy, but the US has grown much faster than Europe, even though historically none of the economies have been very impressive. The technocrats and their regulation tend to stifle the innovation and growth they seek to encourage. This is, in short, what happened since Virginia Postrel wrote her book. The beginning of the 2000s was the era of the technocrats. Every crisis was handled by central banks and followed by new regulation, both with a growing sense of what they could control. From democratization through warfare and torture, to the management of the economy to make losses disappear, and disease control through lockdowns. The unintended consequences that were bound to follow has been ignored, explained away, or postponed by growing debt. The bitter irony is that the opposition to this technocratic elite are the other part of the stasis camp, the reactionaries, or as they tend to call themselves these days and in this rift, the people. This is the political battle that is increasingly being fought in the 2000s, and why many of you in here might feel rightly that there is something fundamentally wrong with both these camps. The future is here now, and the enemy's won. In other words, there are reasons for concern about the future. Only they are not the usual culprits. It's not neoliberalism, globalization, and liberal democracy based on fundamental individuals' freedoms and rights. Our problems do not stem from the end of the 20th century, but from the beginning of the 21st century and the increasing reliance on the state and on financing the future by debt. When you think about it, it's quite logical. If you handle all problems and crises by not confronting them, but postponing them to the future, who in the end wants to go to that future? A future where all the problems have to be confronted and all the debts paid. This is also why you, the young, in most countries are the ones that in one way or another have to bear most of the burden. This is no reason to give up, mind you. There have been hard times before. If these are bad times for fundamental freedoms and democracy, and it's been going downhill for the last 18 years, compared to the 1970s, it's still far more free. And another thing, it is the free democratic societies, for all their seeming weaknesses, that over time has been the most permanent. Countries like Sweden, our Nordic neighbors, the UK, the US, and many more have permanently been democracies during the whole time, while the authoritarians most have shifted in one way or another. One of the most important points of creating a better future is realizing and confronting contemporary problems. Remember that hope is not a prognosis, but a virtue. You have to work for it, you have to fight for it, and you have to look for it. The human spirit and the good within us and in our deeds are always our ally. Many of the best novels are written about the struggle against oppression. Ayn Rand, if you remember, wrote quite a few of her first novels are about the struggle against oppression, identifying what she is against. It's as important as other struggles for a better future. Truth is another ally, if nothing else, about policy mistakes and their effect. After all, that is what made Frédéric Bastiat into an unforgettable economist, demonstrating, for example, that a young hooligan breaking a window do not increase wealth and create jobs, no more than politicians spending money that you could have used in another way, the way that are not seen unless you point them out. And when you do this, and when you do this work, helped by the many excellent lectures at this very seminar, you'll find what Ayn Rand thought about when she said that those who strive for a better future already live in it. Thank you. So can I get help with questions?
Yeah, of course. Anyone wants to ask a question?
So, in the Western world, we have a rise of right-wing populism, especially in somewhere like Sweden. In Britain, we've had the Reform Party, the British Reform Party, and in Sweden, we've had the rise of the Swedish Democrats, who, in both cases, are kind of economically centre-left while selling nationalistic values. And there's been no real growth in the UK in libertarian values and in Sweden. How do you optimistically sell liberty to countries where they're seen as the role of government almost like a shield made of the people, whose job is to paternalistically protect people from themselves? How do you sell liberty to what it serves to? So, for example, in the UK as well, we've got a public healthcare system that's becoming more and more broken down and to the so expensive to run. But it's also treated like the NHS and National Health Service, almost treated like the national religion we've got. So to criticise the British healthcare system and say actually need reform is where people generally get offended. It's almost like sacrilegious. It seems like how do you sell these ideas in countries where the ideas of liberty are seen as something that's not a positive thing, so they will actually harm most vulnerable people in society? How do you tell people that innovation and freedom lead to brighter outcomes, brighter, more economic growth, and actually are kind of our hopes for the future that so many people fought for throughout history?
Excellent question. The answer, as far as is 3 points. The first is the obvious one pointed out, that the alternative that those people are seeking themselves through to is a non-alternative. It's a reactionary, often hateful, playing on their feelings of resentment and that something is wrong, but not taking them in any constructive political way, often pointing out groups and people to hate as a kind of, bread and theater, and but they take the bread themselves, getting corrupt. So the populist alternative is not an alternative, but pointing that out is not enough, because, and that is one of my main point here, that there are real reasons for concern, and those reasons stem mostly from policy decisions made not by the fringes, but by big consensus in the countries concerned, by the established parties. There was an extremism also in the middle, also in the parties that are seen as a reliable establishment. They decided on the Iraq War. They decided on the technocratic turn of and development of the European Union, and they are behind getting all this regulatory environment where In the US, the last 3 decades has seen around 3,000 new regulations added yearly, and the number of abolished regulations during the same period was around 20. All these policy mistakes stem from the political center, the technocrats, the elites. And you need to criticize them as well, and they need to be self-critical, otherwise the discontent will only grow and find their way to, unfortunately, nasty alternatives, because that's the most easier subject. And the problem with freedom is this. When I was in my 20s, I was a couch potato. I was quite fat. I shied eating healthy and getting exercise much more then than I do now, which might seem obvious. And it's the same thing with freedom. Freedom is demanding. Freedom is scary. Freedom is risky and demands of us our best effort. That is what we trade for others' best effort. There are no sure things, because you always have to be invested in the better future. It demands effort. And the less you are allowed to try it, as with, that is why it is bad to have socialism for the risk, making financial industry and investment less risky. This is what it's all about. We get more scared of freedom, and this is what people feel. That is why they feel this is definitely not the option I want. So in a way, we have to be paternalistic, anti-paternalism, telling people that you really want this freedom, trust me. And that is, of course, the problem at the moment. And how we should do that successfully, I unfortunately have no answer for, because I've tried for 30 years and it's been going downhill. But I see no other option than trying, but realizing these three things. Where's the microphone?
Which one is worse and bigger danger for future? Economic balloon and cheap credits, like we used before 2008, or sustainable and not sustainable, like a single economy and high rates and hyperinflation, like we see like in Turkey right now?
I see them as a bit of the same. I mean, when you get the runaway effects, then you have continued for a very long time with the cheap stimulus. So they're part of the same problem, but of course they are much worse when you get into the hyperinflation, because with inflation, money is not everything in this world, but during hyperinflation, you see that it's quite much. There is very much of value that is inflated away during those periods. Turkey is bad, but it's not the worst example. That is why it's fundamental to fight inflation, even with high interest rates for moments, so that it doesn't get into a runaway position. But it is taxing for the economy to have high interest rates as well. You want to avoid that too.
So I know the person who used the part of the module view for reference, if people don't know about like the centre-right Liberal Conservative Party in Sweden. Do you think that party apparatus, especially those which are going to have like a bottom-up infrastructure, are practical means to try to influence positive libertarian ideas, or do you think being involved in a political party that's not necessarily built on libertarian principles is a waste of time and a waste of energy?
I do not think that. I think that you could do, and you have to, work in every area possible. I think, and recent history is quite a good example. I mean, what I've called free societies here, they're not perfect in any ways. There are many important reforms, I think, that would do them much better. But avoiding the big mistakes, keeping the broad democracy, keeping alternatives that you can respectfully live with and discuss with and exist aside along with is all the more important than getting everything, every detail politically exactly where you want it. Every issue is important, of course, but it can be discussed. You can live with it, you can question it. But the fundamental freedoms that are at risk in these days are even worse. Of course, you should realize the problem and describe the problems with the political parties, especially one recent development that I go into in my book that I didn't have time to write about is the growing professionalization of what used to be a political representation. We used to have politicians that was representatives, but now it's more of a career move, at least in Sweden and many other countries. You see almost all politicians that end their political career, they go over into the PR sector or the lobbying sector. And this uniting of state and company influence is not sound for a free economy. And we see that is one reason behind the growing regulation and why no one is really proposing a radical alternative. So you have to point out and possibly, if you can, withstand these pressures when you go into it. And that is why a populist, being active in a populist movement might sometimes be the preferable alternative, just because that could be a force for good, given what the establishment accomplishes through a self-reliant technocracy. Everyone's hungry.